Hello and welcome to the first episode of a brand new series from the Morning Star. My name is Ceren Sagir and today we are joined by a very special guest, Andrew Feinstein, who is a former South African MP who fought against apartheid in South Africa along with Nelson Mandela. And he's still fighting against the same system today as a proud Jewish supporter of Palestinian rights. Andrew has written 2 books on the global arms trade. He's done some extensive research on it, and he's recently been editing another one. So today we're going to be diving into that topic with him, especially regarding Britain and the arms trade role with Israel. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So you've just come back from doing a book tour on this, the monstrous anger of the guns, how the global arms trade is ruining the world and what we can do about it. Could you tell us a little bit about what your book is about, how the tour went?
Absolutely. So the book was produced in collaboration with Jeremy Corbyn's Peace and Justice Project and my own organization, Shadow World Investigations. There are a number of co-editors, the most important of whom is my colleague Rona Mickey, who was really instrumental in putting this book together. And I realized in the process that it's probably easier just to write your own books than to edit them. It was an extraordinary process, and Rona did incredibly well to bring together a group of contributors from all over the world. So what Monstrous Anger of the Guns does is it provides an introduction to the global arms trade and how it affects the world, which, as you can imagine, is not in great ways, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. But also, and perhaps even more importantly, it has chapters from a wide range of activists and campaigners around the world, around their work in taking on the global arms trade, what has worked for them, what hasn't worked for them. And I think if ever there was a need for such a book, sadly, it's currently with what is going on, obviously in Gaza and Lebanon, but also in the Sudan, in the Congo, still parts of a conflict ongoing in Yemen. And it's really important for people to understand what drives these conflicts, because it's a sort of a strange combination of geopolitics, but also there are some quite economic fundamentals that underpin the trade in weapons. And the book tries to get into those as well.
The global arms trade is quite a evolving industry. So according to the Campaign Against Arms Trade, since 2008, Britain alone has exported £68 billion worth of military licenses. And this is just of what we know of. And ironically, it's also including those that are listed as countries of concern by the government itself, including Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, with like its involvement in Yemen. But also around that time, you published your first book as well in 2011, The Shadow World. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the trends, the concerning trends, especially that you've seen during that time?
Yeah. Let me begin where I began, because I've been doing this work for 20-something years now, and never imagined I'd spend half of my life working on the global arms trade. When I was a member of parliament in South Africa, in our young democracy, as Mandela was stepping down, Thabo Mbeki, his successor, decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that South Africa didn't need and has barely used until today. So why did he do it? Well, during our constitutional negotiations that led to our first democratic election in 1994, where I worked as a facilitator, there were these very well-dressed people constantly around the negotiations, and they stood out because of how well-dressed they were. Turns out, I discover after the fact, they are senior executives from the world's arms companies. And what are they doing there? Knowing that Thabo Mbeki is effectively going to be Mandela's prime minister, that Joe Modise, an old ANC operative, head of Umkhonto we Sizwe, our armed wing, is going to be our first democratic defense minister, they start persuading these guys that an arms deal is a great way not only to keep the white generals happy, and like these guys are not celebrating the soon-to-be democracy in our country. So give them toys to play with, you keep them happy. but in addition to which, and very importantly, it's a great way to fund your political party. And the ANC was desperate for money at this point. The Soviet Union, big backer, no longer existed. Countries like Sweden and other Scandinavian countries said, look, you're a political party now, we can't continue to fund you. And we had thousands and thousands of exiles returning to the country and various other challenges. So what do? We engage in this hugely corrupt arms deal. And a brilliant editor of a political newspaper in South Africa described this arms deal as the point at which the ANC lost its moral compass. And when this happened, I assumed that we were just particularly naive and stupid in South Africa. None of us expected to be in government. We were all activists and liberation fighters. So I thought, we were just done by the global world order, by global capitalism. But as I started researching it a bit more, I discovered that what had happened to us happens all over the world all the time. In fact, at the time that Tony Blair and BAE Systems were paying £115 million of bribes to win one contract on this deal, they were doing the same in 6 or 7 other countries, paying well over £1 billion of bribes. And this is how this trade works. And the money indeed is used to fund our politics as well, because when bribes are paid, so for instance, when on the most corrupt commercial transaction in history, Britain paid £6 billion of bribes through BAE Systems to the Saudi royal family. Not all that money goes to the Saudis. This was on a huge deal called the Al Yamama arms deal. Some of that money comes back to Britain in what we call the feedback principle. So on that particular deal, Margaret Thatcher's wastrel son, Mark, was paid £12 million for nothing. The chief executive chairman of BAE Systems, received an apartment in Mayfair in central London, which in the mid-1980s was worth £6.5 million. All sorts of intermediaries received money. But then, most importantly, the biggest arms dealer or intermediary on the deal distributes money to a whole lot of ordinary people in Britain on the understanding that that money will be donated to the Conservative Party. So this is how the arms trade not only corrupts world trade, not only intensifies the sorts of conflicts we're engaged in and ensures that conflict is always used rather than diplomacy to resolve differences, but it is also corrupting our own political system. And the kicker in all of this is that these companies, BAE Systems, which at that time was the most corrupt company on the planet, as I've written about extensively, is one of the most heavily subsidized companies on the planet by the fiscus. So we are effectively funding these companies to participate in conflict around the world, currently the genocide taking place in Gaza, while at the same time, we, the taxpayer, are subsidizing this trade that, because it accounts for 40% of all corruption in world trade, because a lot of that corruption is used to fund our own political processes and individual politicians, I should mention, we are effectively, as taxpayers, subsidizing the corrupting of our own political system.
And I'm sure there's quite a few policy areas of the government that the trade influences because of this.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just, there are certain obvious areas, like national security and defense, so-called, where companies like BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, Kinetic, even the Israeli arms company Elbit, which has numerous factories in the UK, even though these are often privately listed companies, they're treated as though they're part of government. So their senior executives have access to incredibly sensitive confidential information that we, the British public, don't have access to. But as importantly, as you suggest, they're incredibly influential in economic policy, in financial policy, in foreign policy, because to keep this system, this corrupt trade going, which effectively oils the wheels of our political systems in the West, you've got to continually be increasing our defense budgets. And therefore we require there to be high levels of conflict around the world. So we've got sort of a vicious circle rather than a virtuous circle in which all of these things feed on each other. But it also ensures that our government, just like in the United States, experiences what the American philosopher C. Wright Mills described as a military metaphysic, where everything we do is perceived through a military mindset and a militarist mindset. And that not only affects daily government policy, it affects the way we perceive and engage with the world. So the gendered nature of the world is largely driven by the sort of centrality of militarism in our mindset, the sort of ways in which we prioritize what we define as national security, all of which takes place in secret, really important to emphasize that, which is why it's so corrupt, because no one has access to the information. So we have this notion of national security, which is purely defense-driven, whereas what we should really be doing is talking about human security, not only safety from security threats, but environmental threats, global pandemics, inequality, food. I mean, we're seeing at the moment Britain has more billionaires than we've ever had in our history. But we've also got more families using food banks than at any time since the end of the Second World War. And it's because we're prioritizing the wrong thing. So it affects our lives in profound and quite exhaustive ways.
Well, I suppose, speaking of which, maybe we can talk about the climate a little bit then, because I can only just imagine the kind of fossil fuel use that's gone into just the production of these weapons and other components of the arms industry. And I did read that global climate spending is less than a quarter of military spending, which is insane. But let's talk about the impacts of the arms industry on climate.
Well, first of all, as you say, there's the disproportion in spending, which is so horrific. Given that the climate catastrophe is an existential threat facing us, the fact that we're so underspending on dealing with it, while we're spending on the one activity that is probably the greatest contributor to that climate catastrophe. And as you say, it starts with the production process, the sorts of raw materials that are needed for a lot of what we call military materiel, so everything that is used in conflict effectively. A huge number of those raw materials themselves come from conflict areas like the Democratic Republic of Congo and others. So again, there's this sort of self-reinforcing perpetuation that is taking place. The Pentagon is widely regarded as the biggest institutional contributor to the world's carbon footprint. But of course, the military contribution to climate is excluded from international climate treaties. So we actually have no idea what the military, what we call their carbon bootprint is, because their governments ensure that they don't have to reveal it to anybody. So we have to speculate. And by dint of the fact that they don't want to reveal it, suggests it's bloody awful. And by calculations that have been done by colleagues of ours in the United States of America, we're pretty confident in the estimate that the Pentagon is the biggest institutional polluter on the planet. But then, of the very worst type of fuels used, which is jet fuel, 25% of all jet fuel used in the world is used by military aircraft. So that's the second thing. And this is often when they're not even in conflict, because to justify these ridiculous defense outlays, we're all used to looking up at the sky in Britain and other Western countries. And we see, first of all, there's often noise, and then we see these trails from these military jets that are just doing practice exercises. And those are huge contributors. But then, of course, by far the largest contributor is conflict itself. Because what it does is it not only despoils the natural environment, it releases all sorts of chemicals and gases into the environment. So imagine, let's just take the case of Gaza at the moment. In all of those buildings, because of what has effectively been a blockade for decades by Israel, a lot of the materials used for construction in Gaza contain a lot of asbestos, for instance, or have a lot of other metals that we would rather not use if they actually had access to the sorts of things that we have access to in most of the world. So when these are bombed, when they are destroyed, it's not like the asbestos and the other gases and chemicals just disappear. Of course, they go into the environment. So that's the first thing. What it does to the soil, obviously what it does to the natural environment, to trees and foliage of other sorts, what it does to water, it often makes it undrinkable for generations and generations. And then the reality of conflict is that one of the most common consequences is the movement of people, huge numbers of people. And we're seeing that. We've seen it in Yemen. We're seeing it in northern Gaza at the moment in the most horrific ways. And that movement of people itself has a devastating impact on the environment. So I can't think of an activity as much as war that has the same devastating impacts on our environment.
BAE Systems especially has been talking about sort of a green war for the past 2 decades. They're always bringing in ideas about green munitions. But is like an eco war or eco weapons possible?
I can only laugh, and there's as much despair in my laughter as there is just bemusement, to be honest with you. When I was writing The Shadow World, as I was about to go, well, I thought I was about to go to the publishers, I had written to BAE Systems to give them the right of reply, which they refused. On legal advice, they were told not to engage with me in terms of what I was writing about them, because I'd been going to their AGMs for years and challenging their chairman, and it's always a chairman rather than a chairperson, about their involvement in corruption in my own country, in South Africa and around the world, around their involvement in appalling conflicts. But just after I got this letter from the chairman saying, we're not going to engage with you, I got a call from a senior executive, and she very excitedly told me that they're in the process of developing a green bomb. So with a degree of skepticism, I said to her, so we're talking here about a bomb that kills people, but is nicer to the environment as it does so. And she said, exactly, as though, you're not as stupid as we've all assumed you are for all these years. So I thought, oh, well, that's a particular take on the world, I suppose. A few months later, as we were going to press with the final edition of the book, I called her back and I said to her, so how is the green bomb coming on? And there was this awkward pause. And she said, oh, that. Yeah, we scrapped that. It was too expensive. Now, the notion that while you are killing people, you should be concerned about the environment so that human life can continue and prosper seems to me a profoundly philosophically bankrupt concept from the beginning. These companies, the defense companies, are not just amongst the most inefficient companies that I've ever come across. If it wasn't for the fact that we don't exist in anything vaguely approximating a free market, that we live in a system of corporate welfarism, and that these companies are the biggest beneficiaries of state subsidy and support, none of these companies would be in business. They wouldn't survive. But they are the most rapacious. They are the least moral and ethical of all private companies. And that's saying something. I mean, this is not a good standard here that they're topping. So to think that they would for a moment be concerned about the environment and would be serious about developing eco-wars or more environmentally friendly ways to kill human beings is, in my opinion, patently absurd.
Sounds absurd. Going back to sort of these relationships with government and these companies, how did Britain become so embedded in the Israeli arms supply chain? It's one of the huge contributors to the trade. So how did this happen?
It's really important here to understand a number of things. First of all, is the normal sort of government to defense company relationship. And as we mentioned earlier, it's a relationship like no other. It doesn't matter that these are privately listed companies. They're treated as a part of government. In addition to which, there's what we refer to as the revolving door, or what a report at CAT recently said, because of how much this happens, rather than a revolving door, we should refer to it as an open plan office. There is so much movement of people between government and these companies, our intelligence services, our military services, and the highest echelons of politics. So that I remember when I first came to this country, it was dizzying to me how I would see people at the BAE AGM who had been in politics what felt like 2 minutes before. And, you know, you might not remember, there was a guy called Michael Portillo who was defense secretary. And Michael Portillo literally went from his office at the Ministry of Defense straight onto the board of BAE Systems. These personal relationships, and of course there's a material and economic dimension to them that's crucially important, because you're effectively getting paid once you leave office for decisions you make and actions you take while you're in office, which I believe is a form of systemic corruption that we call state capture. So it's important to understand that dimension of it first. Then we look specifically at Britain's relationship with Israel. And here we have to understand Israel's unique part or role in the global arms trade. And that is, it acts effectively as a research and development laboratory for the Western arms industry, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom. There's an extraordinary book by Anthony Lowenstein called The Palestine Laboratory that is the best thing that's ever been written about the Israeli arms trade, and he's recently released an updated version of it. And the reason it's called the Palestine Laboratory is because the occupied Palestinian territories are effectively used as testing ground for Western weapons that have huge Israeli technological inputs to them. And a lot of these weapons are illegal according to international treaties and conventions. But in the West, we still produce them. So to give you an example, white phosphorus is being used in the assault on Gaza and probably in Lebanon. White phosphorus is banned by an international treaty. But the United States of America is supplying Israel with all of the white phosphorus that it is using in Gaza. Britain. Now, Britain is providing some key components to the F-35. The F-35 is a jet fighter, supposedly, the most expensive weapons system in human history. It has cost the American taxpayer over $2 trillion. And according to a defense inspector general in the United States of America, the brains of the thing don't work properly. So it's being used by Israel in Gaza and Lebanon as if it was an old-fashioned basic bomber, dropping bombs and missiles. But we, the taxpayers of the world, have paid trillions and trillions for it. Now, this F-35 has been used in the majority of the war crimes that have been committed in Gaza. And without Britain's contribution to it, they wouldn't be flying. And the reality is, under pressure from over a year of constant protests, of constant anger by the vast majority of people in this country at the government's stance on the genocide being committed in Gaza, this government deigned to halt 10% of arms sales to Israel, but won't tell us what that 10% is. Now, the reality is, it's probably nonsense that isn't even being used by Israel in its onslaught in Gaza. But when it comes to components and spare parts for the F-35, we can't stop that because we are part of a global supply chain. This is a jet made by Lockheed Martin in the United States of America with the involvement of dozens of countries. The reality is the vast, vast majority of weapons today are made by a variety of countries. So what our disingenuous government is effectively saying is we can't stop any arms exports, even if they're being used to commit a genocide, to commit war crimes, in violation of international humanitarian law, because we're part of an international supply chain. It's an absolute nonsense. But this is the way in which the defense industry, run as a private business, turning public funds, taxpayers' money, into private profits, but is an absolutely integral part of government and is treated in policy decisions like that one by our government as though it is a part of government. So we have this complete contradiction of a private entity effectively being advantaged in the most appalling and extreme ways by the public sector.
So our readers would, of course, be aware of the partial ban on the license exports. But just as a reminder for our listeners, yes, the F-35s were exempt from the announcement by David Lammy about banning 30 out of 350 total valid licenses. And these are stealth fighter aircrafts that are used to drop bombs on Gaza, and that it's basically caused some of the most devastating scenes in the past year, especially with the Jaliba camp attacks.
And also some of the hospital bombings.
Hospital bombings, yes. Yeah. But yeah, when you were talking about the sort of the lobbying that's going on between these companies, it kind of seems that it's stemmed from decades of work, decades of lobbying between the two sides. And it kind of makes me think, every time a war ends, the statement "never again" is thrown around. So it just kind of shows how disingenuous governments are about that slogan themselves.
So two things in response to that. The one is it's gone way beyond lobbying. The other industries have to lobby. The defense sector has captured the state. It's not about lobbying anymore. It's about the defense sector determining what the state does. And you could argue to some extent there are a few other sectors where that happens as well. But defense is probably the most obvious example. The notion of never again, which obviously emerged from the Holocaust during the Second World War. As some of your listeners might know, my mother was a Holocaust survivor. She lost dozens of her family, mainly in Auschwitz. She survived the war in Vienna in Austria, where she was growing up. She was hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years. That's how she survived. And she emerged from that with this notion of never again ringing in her ears. And key to the idea of never again was the creation of an entire infrastructure or architecture of international law to try and ensure that never again could a state perpetrate a genocide in the way that the Nazis did, and that those who knew did nothing for many years, and many claimed they didn't know. And when my mom, who married my father, who was South African, landed up in apartheid South Africa, she felt the black South Africans were being treated like the Jews of Europe had been treated, and came to the very obvious conclusion that never again applied to all humanity, not just Jews. And what we have seen in our support, and when I say our, the so-called Western government support for Israel's genocide in Gaza, we have effectively destroyed that entire architecture of international law. So at the moment what we have is the absurd situation where we have our government criticizing, in my opinion correctly, Russia for its attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, while not just saying nothing about Israel's commission of far, far worse atrocities on the civilians of Gaza, partly the West Bank and Lebanon. But we have them enabling, facilitating, providing political and diplomatic cover, and through our defense companies, profiting from the genocide that Israel is committing. So much for never again.
So Britain's role in supplying the Israeli arms chain sort of extends just beyond the borders of mainland UK. It's got quite a few RAF bases internationally, and there are 2 bases in particular in Cyprus. And these are sort of described by the RAF itself as forward-mounting bases for overseas operations in the Middle East. What exactly happens here? What are they used for? Do you have an idea?
So they're little areas where British law applies in part, sometimes in full, that Britain uses to ensure its military influence around the world. Now, the number of bases that Britain has pales into insignificance by comparison to the United States of America, which has proliferated the world with bases. But Britain's are strategically very important depending on where the conflict is and how difficult it is for the Americans to move military equipment into those conflicts. So what we have seen is the RAF bases on Cyprus have been the key conduit for the weaponry being provided to Israel for its onslaught against Gaza. We have flights taking off from these bases almost every day, and the government will not reveal what is on those planes. So clearly, it's not food and it's not aid for Palestinians. I think we can make the assumption that it is about 99.99% certain that there is weaponry. We also, as Declassified UK has uncovered, have seen a variety of American equipment being transported through those bases on Cyprus to Israel. So the RAF bases on Cyprus are absolutely integral to Britain and America's provision of constant weaponry to Israel, to the extent that I would estimate, and it's very difficult to do this accurately because all of this information is kept so secret, but I would estimate that if we stopped supplying weapons, spare parts, components through Cyprus and other places to Israel from America and Britain, and you could probably add Germany to that, within about 4 days, Israel's assault on the Palestinians would have to end. Why? Because they would run out of the ordnance, the bombs and missiles, etc., etc. They would run out of ammunition. They would run out of spare parts and components for the F-35s and the various other military vehicles of varying types that they're using. But people say, oh no, that can't be true, because if we stopped supplying them, they just get it somewhere else. The reality is, you don't build up a defense and military infrastructure in a matter of months, even years. It takes decades. So Israel couldn't suddenly say, oh, okay, well, if you're not going to supply us, we'll just get equipment from somewhere else, from Bulgaria, or from Russia, or from China. First of all, a lot of those countries might not want to sell to Israel because they might be a bit more ethical about a genocide being committed than Western governments have been. Secondly, you can't just take that ordnance, those arms, and stick them on the hardware you already have, the planes, the tanks, etc., etc. They simply won't be compatible. So it will set Israel's military operations back by years and years and years. So as we are seeing the genocide live streamed on our screens every day, we have to remind ourselves that it is happening because of us. And we have it within our power to stop it, and our governments have chosen not to. And we must never let them forget what they are doing to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of innocent human beings.
Yeah, it's horrifying to think that it could be stopped that quickly and that then and then. Let's focus on some of the amazing work that is being done to help stop that. I guess I want to talk a little bit about direct action methods taken by groups like Palestine Action. They have been targeting companies, but most specifically BAE Systems, the factories, and also some of the financial backers of this company, like Barclays. They have been targeting Barclays bank branches for months, causing huge financial damages onto their sites. And in fact, Palestine Action did say earlier this month that Barclays has now, it's been revealed that they've sold off all of its shareholdings of BAE Systems, and they did say that they believe that the bank just couldn't keep up with the costs of the damage being done to them, and this all sort of outweighed the financial profits that were coming in from their shareholdings. So we can see that there has been some sort of success stories with direct action, and we've seen this with boycotting as well, with McDonald's announcing loss in profits. But looking at the bigger picture, in terms of really bringing down the arms trade or bringing down wars, is direct action, does it work? Is that the right way to go?
So Monstrous Anger of the Guns, the book, has a number of different forms of direct action in the various contributions. And Palestine Action have contributed a brilliant chapter to the book about the principles of their struggle, how they started up, and how they're keeping going in this extraordinarily organic way, because significant numbers of their activists, their actionists, are being arrested. But it makes absolutely no difference to the frequency or intensity of their actions. I've been working on the arms trade in one way or another for 23 odd years. Palestine Action has been around for 3, maybe almost 4 years. They've done more in that time to hinder the global arms trade than I've done in 23 plus years. I have no doubt that direct action works. I have no doubt that it is absolutely essential to dealing with what is an out-of-control arms industry that is, as we've been discussing, sponsored by, facilitated by our governments, who in turn receive a lot of money to political parties, politicians, etc., etc. In addition to which, from my own experience of the South African struggle against apartheid, the most important aspects of that struggle were the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign, which was supported by hundreds of millions of people around the world. And targeted, we had 3 main targets, one of which was Barclays Bank. So not much has changed with Barclays. And eventually, because so many young people, students, were closing their accounts with Barclays, were refusing to open accounts with Barclays, they eventually not only withdrew from South Africa, but they massively increased the cost of international borrowing for the apartheid South African state. And that was absolutely instrumental in a deterioration of the quality of life of the white minority in South Africa. And once that started happening, the game was up for apartheid. So important. There was an arms embargo against South Africa, and there were constant other forms of direct action. So I am a huge believer in the importance of direct action, and especially in situations like we find ourselves in now, where I would argue, from a legal perspective, that Britain's exports of weaponry to Israel, just as they were to Saudi Arabia when it was leading a coalition in the conflict in Yemen, that those exports are illegal in terms of British law and in terms of international law. But the judiciary and the legal system effectively gives the freedom to the executive arm of government to basically export arms to whoever it wants, wherever it wants, whenever it wants. So when you find yourself as a citizen whose taxes are being used to commit a genocide, and the law is in fact on the side of the state that is doing that, that is the point at which direct action becomes so important. And what Palestine Action, who I have the greatest of respect for, what they have done is they have closed down 3, possibly 4 of the 10 factories in the UK. They have caused Elbit Systems, which is an absolutely essential and integral part of Israel's arms trade. And remember, we have described Israel as effectively the shop window for Western weapons as well, not just Israeli technology and weapons. So they have closed down some of their factories. They have caused other landlords to not renew leases on Elbit properties where they have factories, and they have caused this company to lose a contract with the Ministry of Defence worth over £280 million. Now, the reality is, if Palestine Action continue the intensity of their actions against Elbit Systems, it is only a matter of time before Elbit no longer exists in the United Kingdom. And that is the outcome that would be in the interests of British taxpayers, and it will be in the interests of attacked populations all over the world. As a consequence of which, our government has been ensuring that actionists get arrested constantly. But now, since Keir Starmer has been in power, since Labour has been in power, the authorities have started to use anti-terror legislation to charge and try and jail members of Palestine Action. There is also a very real possibility that the government will ban Palestine Action outright. This would be a fundamental attack on British democracy and on the right of British people to take action against things that the government is doing with our money that we are totally, totally opposed to. It would be exactly like the attempts by Margaret Thatcher's government to stop the direct action that took place against the apartheid South African state. And we, as British taxpayers, as British citizens, as British residents, cannot allow that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also reminds me of some of the attacks that made by the last government on protesting riots through the public order
Absolutely.
bills and the policing bills.
Absolutely. And there is a common element to a lot of these actions. It's my own constituency MP, Keir Starmer, who, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, would not allow an agent of the British state to face trial. This included policemen who had been involved in brutal attacks on protesters, in one instance even killing a protester. This includes British military personnel around the world who had committed murder and other atrocities, and he would not allow them to be prosecuted. Now that he is Prime Minister, he is taking that support of the national security state even further by using anti-terror legislation against direct actionists and even some of those who are protesting the climate catastrophe. So basically what we have in Britain today is our government telling us that it is a terrorism offence to oppose genocide. I would strongly suggest that in any sane society, it should be a terrorism offence to support, enable, and profit from genocide.
Yeah, absolutely. The hypocrisy is huge. And, even under the British government's own policies on licenses, this trade with Israel is actually illegal or unlawful at the very least, because the wording of the policy says that licenses won't be granted if there is a clear risk that weapons will be used to commit or facilitate serious breaches of international humanitarian law, and which we know now for a fact that these breaches are happening. You know, we've seen it with the International Court of Justice speaking out about genocide, calling it a genocide, and no matter how much the other governments try to deny this. But there's also a legal action that's going on that I think I want to head on to. And the Global Legal Action Network, along with Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq, will be taking the government this month over its repeated failures to revoke all of the arms licenses as well. As we mentioned, it's only 30 out of 350 total balances that are now excluded. So I wanted to ask what you firstly think about the success, possible success of this court case, as well as any comparable cases that you might know of.
There have been a number of cases of what we might term strategic litigation against the arms industry in Britain and around the world. They very seldom succeed. That doesn't make them unimportant, because what they do is they bring together information and legal information about what our governments are doing in our name. And they air that, and they force the mainstream media, which is pretty much all the media outside of the Morning Star and one or two others, to engage with some of this information that they're attempting to ignore. That's very important. It puts the government on the spot. There was an attempt, an intervention, a legal intervention, to stop arms sales to Saudi because of its activities in Yemen. There is an extraordinary little film that is worth your listeners watching on the declassified UK website called Wharton's War on Yemen. And in that film, a former very senior legal advisor to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office talks about briefing the then Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, about what British weapons are doing in Yemen and the fact that Britain is violating international law and probably its own law in continuing these arms sales. She recounts, distraught, how Boris Johnson joked and giggled while she was giving this advice. That is the way in which our government engages with these sorts of things. It is terrifying. But this current case that you mention is perhaps the most important challenge to our legal system that we have seen for generations and generations. Because if the legal system, as it has in the past, again sides with the British state and effectively allows the British state to trample all over British and international law because it believes there is an executive imperative to run our geopolitical relations as the executive sees fit to do so, then we will be able to say without a shadow of the doubt that the legal system in Britain is broken. Because if our legal system cannot protect the civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, in Yemen, in Sudan, in the Congo, from the awful consequences of having British weaponry rain down on them, then our legal system is not fit for purpose. So in that sense, this is an existentially important case. And it will indicate to us not only the extent of Britain's role in a genocide that, I must be honest with you, the like of which I never imagined I'd see in my lifetime. It will also suggest that our legal system is totally incapable of holding our government to account. And that has terrifying political and constitutional consequences for the United Kingdom.
So before we finish off, I do want to ask about some of your experiences with the campaigning in South Africa. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about BDS, but what would you say is probably the biggest lesson that we can learn from the apartheid in South Africa and how to stop apartheid?
There are so many lessons from it. But the biggest is that ordinary people in the country concerned, South Africa in this instance, but also people all over the world, have agency and can make a difference, can change government policy, can make things so uncomfortable for what is an undemocratic, authoritarian, brutal state without a meaningful rule of law. And the way in which I encapsulate this, and I'm sorry to personalize it in this way, but in 1986, I had to leave South Africa at incredibly short notice to avoid serving in the apartheid military and being arrested because I'd got involved with ANC activities in townships and squatter settlements around Cape Town where I grew up. And the night before I was leaving, I drove up a little hill that overlooks the city. And I thought to myself that I will never again be able to set foot in the city or country of my birth. Because at that point, 1986, the apartheid state seemed so powerful. It was getting so much overt and particularly covert support from the Western world. Our military seemed so powerful at that point. It was causing constant devastation in black areas of the country. The reality is, 4 years later, 4 years, at what seemed like one of the darkest points in our apartheid history, 4 years later, the ANC was unbanned, our exiles could return, and our political prisoners were freed. And a process of transition to democracy for the first time in our over 340-year history was initiated. A further 4 years later, we had a largely violence-free, fair, democratic election in which Nelson Mandela was elected our first democratic president. So sometimes it is at the darkest moments, and this feels like one of the darkest moments in post-war human history that I can remember. But sometimes at these incredibly dark moments lie the seeds of significant and fundamental change. So I think if the contributions to monstrous anger of the guns show us anything, if the experience of South Africa teaches us anything, it's that we can, as ordinary human beings, force even what seem like the most powerful governments on the planet to change course. And that is why, as is suggested in the book by so many absolutely brilliant activists and campaigners, we have to intensify the pressure on our governments and on the Israeli state and all who support them in ways like we have never seen in human history before, because otherwise the slaughter will continue.
It's a very powerful note to end on, and Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's been an amazing first episode for the series, and just before we close off, is there any sort of projects or events that are upcoming that you would like our viewers to be aware of? And of course, where can we...
So please, sure. So you can find the book in all bookstores. You can obviously find it online. You can also buy it through the Peace and Justice Project on their website. And I believe, although he might not hold me to this, but I believe that if they send you your book, it'll be signed by Jeremy Corbyn. There are loads and loads of book events happening in community centers, in bookshops, on campuses around the country, where many of the amazing contributors to the book are giving talks about the book and how it affects the current situation. There is obviously the Glan legal case that we refer to. People must keep a focus on that and must write to their MPs, must voice their support for that legal campaign. And of course, there are the campaigns of groups like Palestine Action that continue. And if we see a legal onslaught against Palestine Action, I would strongly, strongly encourage your readers and listeners to support them in whatever way they possibly can. Because if they are stopped from taking direct action in support of the people of Palestine, it will be no different to stopping people fighting against the racist state that was apartheid South Africa. But just as apartheid fell in South Africa, so will apartheid and occupation in Israel-Palestine fall. But it's going to take the active involvement of all of us.
Thank you, Andrew, for joining us today and sharing your personal experiences too. I hope our viewers enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed talking to you today. And to our viewers, we will see you soon in another episode. But in the meantime, you can read all about the movement against the arms trade, against Israel's war on Gaza and Lebanon, as well as many other topics from around the world in the Morning Star. And see you soon.